I needed to clear my head. Life had become too loud, too overwhelming, and the weight of everything was pressing down on me. That's why I decided to go camping in the Appalachian Mountains, just me and nature. It was the perfect escape from the noise and chaos of the world. I craved solitude, a place where my thoughts could settle and I could breathe again. After spending the night packing my gear, I set out early in the morning, driving up to a trail I had hiked a few times before. It was far from any tourist-heavy spots, isolated and peaceful, exactly what I needed. The drive through the mountains was beautiful, winding roads, towering trees, and the early morning mist clinging to the forest. With every passing mile, the outside world seemed to slip further away. When I finally arrived at the trailhead, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The air was cool and crisp as I stepped out of my car, and I could already feel the tension in my body beginning to ease. I shouldered my backpack, tightened the straps, and started the hike. The first day was everything I'd hoped for. I hiked in silence, accompanied only by the sounds of nature, the rustling leaves, the occasional chirp of a bird, the distant rustle of squirrels darting through the underbrush. There was something deeply therapeutic about being alone in the woods. No phones, no traffic, no voices, just me and the trail. After a few hours, I found a perfect spot to set up camp, a small clearing near a gently flowing stream. I could hear the water softly trickling over rocks as I pitched my tent, which added to the tranquility of the setting. The sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the trees. As twilight settled in, I built a small fire, its warm glow flickering against the darkening sky. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, savoring the simplicity of it all. No distractions, no deadlines, just me, the stars slowly appearing overhead, and the crackle of burning wood. I stayed up late that night, staring into the fire, letting my mind drift, my body relaxed in a way it hadn't been in months. This was exactly what I'd been craving. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of curiosity. As peaceful as my campsite was, I wanted to explore. I decided to venture deeper into the woods, off the trail I'd hiked so many times before. There was something about the unknown that beckoned me, a desire to see parts of the forest that most people didn't. The forest felt different as I veered off the trail. The sounds of the birds and the breeze seemed more distant. The trees were thicker, the light filtering through them dimmer. After a couple of hours, I began to notice something strange. In a small clearing ahead, several trees had been deliberately cut down, their stumps sharp and fresh. It wasn't normal. People rarely came this far off the trail, and logging wasn't allowed in this area. Then I saw the tire tracks, faint but unmistakable, leading deeper into the forest. My curiosity piqued, I followed the tracks. My mind raced with possibilities. What could be out here? Maybe hunters or someone living off the grid? I told myself it wasn't anything serious. Probably just some old off-road vehicle tracks that had been left behind. But something gnawed at me, a feeling of unease creeping in as the tire tracks led me further into the unknown. After another hour of walking, I noticed a large clearing ahead. As I approached, I realized what I was looking at: rows upon rows of carefully cultivated marijuana plants, spread out in every direction. The scale of it was shocking. This wasn't just some small patch. This was a massive operation, well hidden from the eyes of casual hikers like me. My heart started to race. I knew immediately that I shouldn't be here. This wasn't the kind of thing that was run by amateurs, and whoever was behind it definitely didn't want strangers stumbling upon their plantation. Before I could turn back, I heard voices, close. Instinctively, I dropped to the ground, hiding behind a thick bush. My heart pounded in my chest as I carefully peered through the leaves. 2 men appeared, walking through the rows of plants. They were armed, each carrying a rifle, and they didn't look like they were just there for protection. These guys were dangerous. Their eyes scanned the area as they spoke in low, tense voices. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I knew that if they saw me, it wouldn't end well. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do if they caught me. I was just a lone hiker, but to them, I'd be a threat, someone who knew too much. I had to get out of there. Slowly, I started backing away, careful not to make a sound. Every snapped twig, every rustling leaf seemed to echo through the forest like a gunshot. My heart raced as I kept glancing over my shoulder, terrified that they would spot me. I was almost far enough away when I misstepped. My foot caught on a root and I fell hard to the ground. The noise was loud, far too loud. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and listened. The voices stopped. Then I heard shouting. They had heard me. Panic surged through me. I scrambled to my feet and took off running, weaving between the trees as fast as I could. The sound of footsteps and voices grew louder behind me. They were coming after me. My lungs burned with every breath as I pushed myself harder, adrenaline flooding my system. The fear was overwhelming. This was no longer a camping trip. It was a matter of survival. I glanced back and saw one of the men not far behind, his rifle raised. My heart nearly stopped. I had to lose them. Up ahead, I spotted a rocky area, a formation of large boulders jutting out from the landscape. Desperate, I sprinted toward it and squeezed between 2 massive rocks, pressing myself into the tight space. I held my breath, my body trembling with fear. I could hear them searching nearby, their voices tense and angry. They were close, too close. I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't find me. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I waited, barely daring to breathe. Finally, the voices began to fade. They were moving away, still searching, but not as close. I waited longer until I was sure they were gone, before cautiously crawling out from my hiding spot. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move. I had to get back to my campsite and get out of there. Carefully, I retraced my steps, moving slowly to avoid making any noise. When I finally reached my campsite, I wasted no time packing up. My hands shook as I stuffed my gear into my backpack, my mind racing with fear. I knew I couldn't stay. Not with those men still out there. With everything packed, I slung my backpack over my shoulder and started down the trail, moving as fast as I could without running. Every sound, the wind in the trees, the crackle of leaves underfoot, made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. The journey back to my car felt endless. Every step was weighed down by fear, every rustle in the trees making my pulse jump. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the trailhead. My car was still there, parked in the same spot. Relief washed over me, but I wasn't safe yet. I threw my gear into the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were trembling as I started the engine and sped down the mountain road, not daring to look back. My heart pounded in my chest as I drove. The image of those armed men burned into my mind. When I finally reached a small town, I stopped at a gas station and called the authorities. They thanked me for reporting it and said they would investigate, but I couldn't shake the fear that had gripped me. Even as I drove the rest of the way home, the entire experience felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But it was real, and it was terrifying. I knew one thing for sure: I would never stray off the beaten path again. I went camping in the Black Hills of South Dakota to get away from it all, searching for some peace and quiet under the stars. The Black Hills had always been a place of calm for me, a place where the world slowed down and I could just breathe. I found a nice, secluded spot in a clearing surrounded by trees. The late afternoon light filtered through the pines as I set up my tent, the air crisp and fresh with the scent of pine needles. After getting the fire going, I sat back in my camping chair, feeling at ease with the quiet hum of the forest around me. As the sun dipped below the horizon and dusk gave way to night, the forest fell into a peaceful silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl somewhere in the trees. It was perfect, just what I'd been craving. But then, faintly at first, I heard the distant hum of engines, TVs. I frowned. The Black Hills were a popular spot for off-road vehicles, but I had deliberately chosen this remote area to avoid any of that. I told myself they were probably far off, and it wasn't worth worrying about. The noise was distant, barely noticeable over the sound of the wind in the trees. Still, it broke the peaceful silence I had hoped for. But the hum grew louder. What had been a faint annoyance soon became a roar. I could see their headlights now, bouncing through the trees as they approached. The knot in my stomach tightened as the lights drew closer, the engines screaming through the night. 4 ATVs burst through the trees and pulled into my clearing, their tires kicking up dirt and rocks as they came to a stop near my tent. I watched uneasily as the riders dismounted. There were 4 of them, laughing and shouting at each other, their loud voices echoing off the trees. My firelight flickered across their faces, casting them in an eerie glow. One of them, a tall guy wearing a bandana, sauntered over to me, sizing me up with a smirk on his face. His eyes flicked over my tent, my gear, and finally settled on me. "Nice spot you got here," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile and trying to keep my tone friendly. "Just here for a quiet weekend?" The others gathered around him, eyeing my setup. One of them, a burly guy wearing a leather jacket, kicked at one of the tent pegs, laughing as it popped out of the ground. My heart sank. They weren't just passing through. They were here to cause trouble. "Got any beer?" the guy in the leather jacket asked, his eyes fixed on my cooler. "No," I lied, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Didn't bring any." In truth, I had a few cans stashed in my cooler, but I didn't want to give them any reason to stay longer. "Too bad," the tall guy with the bandana said, his smirk widening. "Guess we'll just hang out here for a while then." He sat down on a rock near my fire, making himself comfortable as if he owned the place. The others followed his lead, sitting or standing around my campfire, their loud conversation filling the once peaceful clearing. I felt trapped. My mind raced with thoughts of how to get them to leave. If I told them to get lost, it might escalate things, but doing nothing felt just as dangerous. Their voices were loud and brash, their laughter harsh. Every few minutes, one of them would make a crude joke, glancing in my direction and laughing. I tried to focus on my fire, hoping that if I ignored them long enough, they'd get bored and leave. But then, the big guy in the leather jacket stood up and started rummaging through my gear, flipping open my backpack and tossing my belongings onto the ground. "Hey!" I shouted, standing up without thinking. "Leave my stuff alone!" The guy looked at me, surprised by my outburst. For a second, there was silence. Then he laughed, a deep, menacing sound. "We're just having a look," he said, kicking my backpack to the ground, scattering its contents. I felt a surge of anger, but fought to keep it in check. My hands were shaking as I spoke. "Please, just leave my stuff alone." The tall guy with the bandana stood up and walked over to me, getting in my face. His eyes were cold and his smirk was gone. "You got a problem?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "No problem," I said quickly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just want to be left alone." For a moment, he stared at me, his face unreadable. Then, to my surprise, he turned and walked back toward his friends. "Let's go," he said, sounding bored. "This place is lame anyway." Relief washed over me as they started to mount their ATVs. They revved their engines, ready to leave, and for a brief moment, I thought it was over. But just as they were about to pull away, the big guy with the leather jacket grabbed a burning stick from the fire. With a wild grin on his face, he hurled it at my tent. The flames caught quickly, the fabric igniting in seconds. They roared with laughter as they sped off into the night, their headlights disappearing into the trees. I stood there, frozen for a moment, watching in horror as my tent went up in flames. Snapping out of it, I grabbed my water bottle and rushed to put out the fire, but it was too late. The tent was already ruined, the flames having devoured it in seconds. I managed to stop the fire from spreading to the rest of my gear, but the damage was done. My tent, my sleeping bag, everything was a charred mess. Anger and relief warred within me. They were gone, but they had left me in a terrible spot. The quiet and solitude I had come for had been shattered. The forest, once peaceful, now felt dangerous and hostile. I couldn't shake the feeling that they might come back. I kept looking around, jumping at every sound, every rustle in the leaves. It wasn't safe to stay here anymore. I packed up what little I could salvage, my hands still shaking, and started the long hike back to my car. The darkness felt oppressive now, and the sounds of the forest that had once calmed me now seemed menacing. Every snap of a twig made my heart race, every shadow made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting for me. It was a long, grueling trek through the dark, but just before dawn I finally reached my car. Exhausted and shaken, I threw my gear in the back and got in, locking the doors immediately. My hands trembled as I started the engine and pulled out onto the road. The drive back was a blur, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ATVs behind me again, their lights closing in. When I finally reached home, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my statement, promised to investigate, and assured me they'd keep an eye out for the guys, but I don't know if they ever found them. I never heard back, and frankly, I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to forget the whole thing. But one thing was for sure. I wasn't camping alone in the Black Hills again. I had been in Adara for nearly a week, documenting wildlife for a project. The days were long but rewarding, spent hiking through the thick, almost untouched forests, photographing birds and other animals that called this remote area home. It was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever worked, but it was isolated. So remote, in fact, that I hadn't seen another soul for days. The wilderness had a way of making you feel both liberated and vulnerable at the same time. On the fourth day, I found a perfect spot to set up camp. It was a small clearing, with soft grass underfoot and the sound of a nearby stream trickling through the trees. The late afternoon sunlight filtered down, casting a warm, golden hue over everything. It was peaceful, almost surreal. After pitching my tent and settling in, I spent the evening reviewing the photos I had taken, satisfied with the day's work. But as I sat there enjoying the calm, I heard something that made me pause, the distant buzz of chainsaws cutting through the forest air. It was strange. I hadn't seen or heard of any logging operations in this part of Adira. The place was supposed to be protected land, reserved for its natural beauty and the wildlife that thrived here. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate the noise the next morning. At first light, I packed up some gear and set off in the direction of the chainsaws. The forest was dense, and I moved cautiously, my boots crunching on the undergrowth as I followed the sound. After about an hour of hiking through the thick brush, I came across a scene that made me stop in my tracks. In a small clearing ahead, I saw a group of men cutting down trees. There were no uniforms, no signs of an official operation. The whole thing felt off, illegal even. I crouched low behind a fallen tree and pulled out my camera. I began snapping photos from a distance, trying to capture evidence without being seen. The men worked quickly, methodically cutting down trees and loading the timber onto trucks. I zoomed in, catching their faces, their equipment, and the fresh stumps littering the ground. My gut told me I shouldn't linger here, so I prepared to slip away. But as I turned to leave, I heard a shout. One of the men had spotted me. He yelled something to the others, and suddenly, all work stopped. Their heads turned in my direction. My heart raced. I tried to walk away calmly, but their voices grew louder, angrier. I could feel their eyes on my back as I hurried back to camp, my mind racing with what might happen next. That evening, as the sun set and darkness crept into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence felt heavier, more ominous. My nerves were on edge, every rustle of leaves putting me on high alert. Then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy and deliberate, approaching my camp. My stomach twisted in knots. Peering out of my tent, I saw 3 of the loggers from earlier, their faces hard and angry, walking straight toward me. The tallest of them, a man with a scraggly beard, called out, "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and accusatory. "I'm just a photographer, taking pictures of the wildlife," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "Show us the camera," he said. Reluctantly, I handed it over. My fingers trembled as he scrolled through the photos. His expression darkened as he came across the shots of them cutting down the trees. He glanced at the others, and without a word, he smashed the camera against a rock. The crack of plastic and glass echoed in the clearing, sending shards of my equipment scattering across the ground. "You shouldn't have taken those," he growled, stepping closer. His eyes were cold, and the threat in his voice was unmistakable. "We don't need any trouble." I swallowed hard, panic rising in my throat. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, backing away slowly. "I'll leave right now. No one has to know." But they didn't seem convinced. The 3 of them moved around me, circling, blocking my escape. My pulse raced as I realized how much danger I was in. I needed to think fast. "I've already sent the photos to someone," I lied, the words spilling out in desperation. "If something happens to me, they'll know where I am." The tall man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, I thought my bluff might have worked, but the shorter one, a man with a deep scar across his cheek, glanced at the others and shook his head. "We can't risk it," he muttered. "She's seen too much." My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they could hear it. I scanned the area, searching for any possible escape route. That's when I saw it, a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. Without thinking, I bolted, my legs moving before my mind could catch up. "Get her!" one of them shouted, and I heard the thunder of footsteps behind me. I ran as fast as I could, branches slashing at my face and arms as I tore through the undergrowth. Their voices grew louder, closer, their footsteps pounding the forest floor like a drumbeat. I stumbled but caught myself, my lungs burning as I pushed forward. Up ahead, I saw the ground drop off sharply, a steep hill. Without slowing down, I half ran, half slid down the incline, barely keeping my balance. At the bottom, I spotted an old abandoned cabin, half hidden by the forest. I dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and decay. I hid behind a pile of rotting logs, trying to calm my breathing, trying to stay silent. The loggers arrived moments later, their voices angry and tense as they spread out, searching for me. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. I could see their shadows moving through the gaps in the cabin walls, their boots crunching on the forest floor just outside. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I waited, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, I heard their voices fade. They were leaving. I stayed hidden, too terrified to move until I was certain they were gone. When I finally crept out of my hiding spot, my body ached from tension and the scrapes from my frantic run. I knew I couldn't stay in the forest any longer. I hurried back to my camp, grabbed what little gear I could carry, and set off in the opposite direction of where the loggers had gone. I walked through the night, the forest that once felt like a sanctuary, now a dark, menacing place. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like one of them coming back for me. By morning, I stumbled into a small town, exhausted and shaken. I went straight to the local authorities and told them everything. At first, they seemed skeptical, as if they didn't quite believe my story. But they promised to investigate. A few days later, as I recovered from the ordeal in town, I heard the news. The authorities had found the illegal logging operation and shut it down. The men had been arrested and I was asked to testify. It was a terrifying experience, but in the end, justice was served. I've returned to wildlife photography since, but I'm much more cautious now. The wilderness still calls to me, but I've learned that even the most beautiful places can hide dangers. And next time, I'll make sure someone knows exactly where I am.